This little train, with its amusing assortment of rolling stock, is typical of branch line Britain just after the war, when the Labour government decided that nationalisation was the way forward. Back in the dark days of 1948, the elderly crew of a little tank engine would commonly find that their locomotive was older than they were. There were 476 different types of steam locomotive in Britain, like the O2 class on the Isle of Wight. The enginemen might be singing for joy on a summer's day, but the country was broke and simply couldn't afford to keep 20,000 steam locomotives of so many different types. Some of them, like this Cardiff dock shunter, were quite literally in a class of their own. They were museum pieces made more expensive by the need to keep spares for each different design. And since the new British Railways empire was so far-flung, with some engines living in country sheds all on their own, the logistics of everyday operation gave no prospect of economy. What was needed, it was thought, 60 years ago, was standardisation of parts and as few classes of engine as possible. Fortunately, there were some modern designs like this Ivet tank engine from the London Midland Railway. It would serve as a blueprint for one of a dozen new standard classes of steam locomotive to be built in the 1950s and 60s. But standardisation meant that some locomotive designs were finished. The Great Western Railway's loading gauge was too wide for the whole of Britain, so its designs couldn't be used nationally. Also working against it was the fact that its engines were right-hand drive, instead of the more usual left-hand drive. And when it came to express passenger locomotives, none of them was suitable for mass production. They all had 3 or 4 cylinders, and for simplicity's sake the new British Railways Board wanted just 2 outside cylinders on its locomotives. So machines like this North Eastern Pacific were rejected as the basis for future designs. At least there was a mixed traffic locomotive waiting in the wings, the LMS Black 5. The Black 5 had a lot going for it, and not just its 2 outside cylinders. The cab, for instance, was an easy place to live for engine men. They all thought the machine was excellent. But British Railways needed more. They needed engines which would run up to 100,000 miles before shopping. And the Black 5s, when fitted with manganese steel liners on the axles, were approaching this magic figure. British Railways had another problem, and that was to preserve morale in each of the 4 railways they'd taken over. The Southern, for instance, had recently produced more than 100 mainline machines, of which it was very proud. But in truth they were temperamental, brilliant in some respects and a nightmare in others, and quite unsuitable as a mass production template. The man in charge, Robin Riddles, would have to be a diplomat as well as an engineer. It was decided that British Railways would deliberately take good bits of engineering from each region of Britain.
There was a lot of politics in it. You had to keep the various railways happy, he had to allow each of the railways to contribute something into the design. They had to be built at the various railway centres by workshops that might not be used to using the methods that mainly Stanier from Churchwood instituted.
So the standard engines turned out to be the interesting mongrel offspring of all the pedigree breeds.
So you had a boiler which was a Western boiler developed by Stanier. You had on the Pacifics a boiler which was a northeastern boiler but with a bell pair developed by Bullied. You had valve gear largely LNER. You had lubrication from LMS. You had the brake gear from LMS out of Great Western, and so on. So you had a hodgepodge of things which annoyed, of course, the diehards on every region.
The best they could do was find common ground, and this was a design with few enemies. The LMS had built a British record 842 of them. They rarely broke down, and the valve gear was where it could be reached. At first, British Railways flirted with the idea of adding 2 wheels under the cab so they could accommodate a wider firebox. But in the end they came back to the trusty English 460 wheel arrangement that had become the norm for mixed traffic engines. And they struggled to improve the Black Five's cab and, more importantly, its boiler. The shape and proportions of a steam engine's innards had always been a black art. Change a detail, like the blast pipe diameter or the slope of the grate, and you change the locomotive's whole character.
I think the Black 5 is probably one of the best all-round classes of engines, sort of based on the Class 5. This particular engine was built in 1936, but for an engine of that era, it's a very, very modern, very comfortable to drive, fire. It's easy to maintain, everything's on the outside. And you know, it'll do anything you ask of it.
British Railways wanted to retain every ounce of power output when designing an improved Black 5, but there was one hitch. It was hoped to use one wheel size for all the standard classes of big engine, and these 6 feet driving wheels were a bit small for express locomotives. The North Eastern and Southern Railways had found that 6 feet 2 inches was perfect for both express and mixed traffic engines, killing the myth that high speed demanded wheels of up to 7 feet in diameter. These Bullied engines, with their 6 feet 2 inch wheels, were good for 90 miles an hour plus. So when the new standard Class 5 engines finally appeared, They had wheels 2 inches taller than the Black 5, a feature amplified by the high-set running boards, which made these engines less aesthetically attractive. By making the cylinders half an inch wider, BR was able to keep power output much the same as on the Black 5s. But to everyone's disappointment, these brand new machines turned out to be drafty and noisy on the footplate.
The cab is a very noisy and cold place. The floor is mostly metal. There's no wood hardly to stand on. So it's noisy because of the metal and it's cold because of the metal. But they fly. They absolutely fly along when they've got steam. As long as they've got more than 200, they fly along.
Not everyone took to the standard Class 5s, but on, for instance, the North Kent Expresses, they made a name for themselves by working shoulder to shoulder with much bigger engines. Some drivers believed they were good for 100 miles an hour. But what were they like to drive?
Right, well first of all the engine is actually mid-gear with the actual steam brake on, the loco steam brake. So the first thing we need to do is actually put it into full forward gear. And we await the guard signal, which we've got. Just to warn anybody that may be in the vicinity. Shut the drain cocks, release the actual steam brake, and open the regulator very, very gently.
Here, a standard Class 5 is restarting its 9-coach train on a 1 in 100 gradient and on a curve, which makes slipping more likely.
Just make sure the train's following. And as we begin to move, we can just very slowly bring the reverser back.
The same train at speed with a gradient sharpening from 1 in 100 to 1 in 80. The engine's going well, with a ribbon of steam escaping from the safety valves as evidence of the boiler's good health. But the standard engines were designed for hard coal, and some of the softer grades didn't work so well, a reminder that no design can be good in all circumstances.
They were an engine built for hard coal, and they didn't like soft coal very much. So we had a lot of trouble with them at 9 Elms when they first came out. Hell of a lot of trouble. We couldn't maintain the sort of fire that would keep steam on soft coal. The smoke boxes used to get full up to halfway up the door, and they were supposed to be self-cleaning. But on our coal, they filled up to halfway up the door, because our coal, being Welsh, didn't break up to go through the screens and out the chimney. That was a problem. They were supposed to be self-cleaning smoke boxes. We cleaned our smoke boxes every day. Now what I discovered was, having ridden on the Great Western, on the kings and castles, I tried firing to them like a king or a castle, with a massive great shovelful of coal, bopping it down about 6 foot into the box, and putting the flap up or shutting the door in between shovelfuls. And I found that worked. And it wasn't the way we were taught to fire on Southwestern engines at all. But it worked.
This unusual double-header of a Black 5 and a Standard 5 shows clearly the latter engine's much higher running boards. A few locomotives of each type were fitted with different valve gear. The Caprotti system offers theoretically better breathing and therefore better performance, but only at the cost of more complication. You can see the spinning drive shafts which operate cams like in a car engine.
The basis of a cam drive machine is that you can separate the timing of the cutting off of the steam entering the cylinders from the timing of the releasing of the steam from the cylinders. In which case you can let the steam linger longer and do more work and release it later. With conventional valve gear, if you cut the steam off early, you also release the steam early because the two events are joined together. So I can see the desire for an improvement using that valve gear. But I do wonder whether such a complicated thing can work on a primitive machine.
The fact that so few were given Caprotti valve gear suggests no great advantage was found, and most of the new Standard 5 engines were left with conventional valves. British Railways now had a manpower crisis. There were easier ways of earning a living in post-war Britain, so the new engines had to be easy to maintain. Grease nipples, roller bearings, rocking grates, hopper ash pans, the new designs were full of labour-saving details. Nothing would ever replace the cork stopper and the oil can, but now there was a chance the engineman would stick with the railways. The fiddly bits were easier to clean, but it was more of a hike to reach that running board. And now tasks like refilling the sandboxes involved a bit of mountaineering. Adding nameplates from scrapped engines of the King Arthur class was evidence that the southern region at least thought the world of the new engines. For some firemen, this was the first padded seat they'd ever seen at work, and the driver had his comfy corner too, with all the controls grouped logically. There was no pretending the Standard 5s were pretty. Those steps up each side of the smoke box were so big that the boiler barrel itself looked a bit weedy. But by and large, the 5s were a success. In the same way that the Black 5 had been the basis of a new mixed traffic locomotive, so a new family of tank engines had their roots in LMS soil. This is the Class 2 tank engine that Ivert was already exporting from the LMS to other regions of Britain, and BR just carried on making them. It was a go-anywhere machine for the smaller jobs, and it had a twin brother, the same engine, but with a tender to give extra fuel capacity. In all, 3 Ivat designs were among the 12 standard classes, with only detail alterations. They could be found tootling along in various corners of Britain, often flushing out geriatric locomotives which had escaped scrapping in quiet corners. The crews liked them, but not as much as the hard-pressed shed-masters did, for these were among the lowest maintenance engines ever built. The BR Class II machines were unique in being expected to run for 3 years before even being considered for shopping, and that's a whole year longer in service than a Class 5. They were modest little machines, except for their commodious cabs, which looked like they belonged on larger locos, and of course they did, for all the standard cabs were much the same, and an engineman could hop onto any of them and know where everything was. This, by comparison, is a Great Western pannier tank engine with its lack of comfort and its jumble of pipes. The crews got used to them, but there was little thought of comfort in a machine which could trace its ancestry right back to Victorian times. Here's a little Ivat galloping along at nearly a mile a minute with 6 coaches. In fact, they were often used to move a dozen coaches of empty stock, but not at this speed. Pushed too hard, and the limits of the Class 5 engine soon becomes apparent. The train is climbing now, and the fireman is working continuously to keep boiler pressure as near the mark as possible. He's closing the firehole door between shovelfuls to stop secondary air cooling the fire, and his driver has one eye on the boiler pressure gauge. These are the signs of a crew who know the engine's near its limit. A bigger machine of the same pedigree was called for, and once again the Midland region had just the ticket. For many years they'd been developing tank engines of the 264 wheel arrangement, and BR developed it further into one of the best locomotives ever built in Britain, the Class 4 standard tank engine.
They're just absolute dreams. They run smoothly, fire nicely, plenty of good lookout, smart cab, very racy appearance, very, very racy with their curved tanks and the foot plating running higher and higher towards the front. I think they're well balanced, beautiful design, and when you think that the Southern were forbidden to run 264 tanks after the River class disaster, and the fact that they then ran 264 BR standards at high speeds till the end of steam, it shows what a well balanced, good engine they were.
5 feet 8 inch wheels and a tractive effort of more than 25,000 pounds, a standard 4 tank could do just about any job. Its driver was perched among ergonomically perfect controls with good visibility and weatherproofing when running in either direction. Across the cab lived the fireman, with all the room in the world to swing the shovel. His controls, like dampers and injectors, were all within easy reach.
If ever an engine was built which was perfection, it was a 264 BR standard. For a start off, they didn't have roller bearings. Like the 9F, which is another nice riding engine, they don't have roller bearings. So you don't get this terrible harsh, rattling, clanging progression. The old-fashioned bearings give you a softer ride. So you've got this feeling of being in a Rolls Royce when you're on a 264 BR standard, just like a Rolls Royce.
This standard 4 tank engine is working bunker first through the Dorset Hills.
Morning! Station Master's obviously happy, man. If you want to pan up the hill, you can see the actual climb we're into now. Opening the regulator up. Very powerful engine, nice range. You all right, Annie? Got to check on the train every 5 minutes, so here we go. Steam chest pressure going to the cylinders, and the other one the steam chest of the boiler. Water's good. We only have one brake, and that's a steam brake on this engine. We're running at 50%. Lock in the rack.
It was on fast suburban passenger duties that the standard 4 tanks did some of their finest work, including the tricky run from London to Brighton, the town where they were designed and mostly built. They were pressed into service on tricky commuter trains where point-to-point timings were hard to achieve. The standard of enginemanship was high, for these were heavy trains.
Oh, about 6 coaches, 6 to 10 coaches. A bit of a sprint going to East Croydon. First stop East Croydon. I think the timing was really tight. On that Brighton line, it's a line that doesn't get any glory because it's only a short line, but the timings were very tight over short distances. Like the Brighton coachman of the Georgian days, Brighton enginemen weren't given an awful lot of credit. But they still had to manage the thing, even though it was over a short distance, and they were very, very smart men.
In the preservation era, these ultimate tank engines have been eagerly seized upon as ideal for the typical heritage line operation. Back in steam days, the plan was to build a tender version, but would it be as good? The answer, sadly, was no. In single chimney form, the steam raising ability of these engines turned out to be a disappointment.
They weren't very well regarded. They tried double chimneys on them. They wouldn't have put double chimneys on them if they'd been all right with the single chimney. They wouldn't go. And when you shut the regulator and coasted, the tender generally tried to climb into the cab with you. It was quite alarming, and all the coal in the tender would again, like the S15, come tumbling through the door all over the footplate. They weren't popular at the Class 4s, but the Class 5s would go if they had steam. They would go like hell. I'm sure they would do 100 miles an hour, a Class 5.
The other Class 4 engine was smaller and of the 260 wheel arrangement, and it was the third of the Trio EV engines based on Ivat designs for the LMS. In recent years, this particular engine has worked on the main line and has earned a reputation as a very handy machine. But in steam days, the type had a mixed reception among enginemen. They were nothing like as popular as their tank engine equivalent.
We had a couple of trips on them. I mean, they were rough riding, especially on the overrun when you were coasting. I didn't do an awful lot on them, but they had the same sort of faults as the Class 4 standard.
At least they were easy to look after. A close inspection of the running gear shows just how accessible everything was. Generations of enginemen had had to crawl around inside the frames trying to reach components which needed daily attention. On these engines, it was all hanging out where you could see it. But what was a standard engine like to operate from a fireman's point of view? We can join the bigger 10-wheeled version on a service train on the Bluebell Railway, with the bowler-hatted fireman Phil Gain as our guide.
It's very fortunate on a BR standard locomotive. Ample room on the footplate, plenty of room to get a decent swing. Firing a locomotive is about 80% technique and 20% of knowledge. As you can see here, Bob's got an excellent movement going, just using minimal effort to propel the coal to the points where it's needed. As a rule, we'll generally put large lumps of coal like that underneath the door, which is the first point of contact with the firebox. They prevent large amounts of cold air being ripped through the bed of the fire and ultimately cooling the fire down. If your fire starts to cool and produce holes, it's not going to steam. If it doesn't make the steam, the engine stops. We build a fire up with a big heavy wedge of coal under the door. That's where the majority of the air is drawn through from the grate. That's where the majority of the heating surface starts from. The next bed of the part of the fire to be built up is around the sides of the firebox and towards the very front end. If you imagine the shape of your firebox, all the water is around the sides. You keep the back and the sides of your fire bed hot and bright all the time. It's more efficient, boils your water faster. Although you can't see it in there, there is a very good bed of fire just under the door. It is shaped like a wedge, approximately 3 feet from the aperture, sloping towards the front of the firebox. All the time the locomotive is being used and producing steam, the water is evaporating. To put water back into the boiler, we have an injector. It is a steam-powered pump that lives under the cab of the footplate. You might be able to hear it now. You can hear a singing noise, a high-pitched whine. And it's these controls here Water is fed through from the tender and steam is admitted, and through a restriction of restrictions and venturi in this injector, the water is forced back into the boiler barrel. This enables you to introduce fresh water to boil into the boiler, and also it cools the temperature of the water inside, very useful in the station to prevent it from blowing off. To aid the firemen as well, we've got two other controls that are used. They're called dampers. And these wheels here allow flaps underneath the ash pan below the fire to open, and they increase the flow of air at the back of the fire or the front. The more air that comes through, the better the combustion. And this is also aided with a control that sits on the driver's side called the blower. This creates a partial vacuum inside the smoke box and helps draw the fire. It is very useful in the preparation of the locomotive in the morning, and also for use in tunnels, because it will prevent what we call a blowback, which is air rushing through the chimney and back through the boiler. If that was to happen, that flame will spit out of there and come back right to the tender door. Not very nice. The driver here is being exceedingly fireman friendly. We'll notice the cut-off position on the regulator, about 40%. Notice the amount of steam that the locomotive is using. We've got 80 pounds of steam entering her cylinders, and we've got 200 pound in the boiler. This is driving at its best. The train is doing line speed. It is being worked very economically. We've got a very thin, very hot, very efficient fire in front of us. It's wonderful. It will take very little preparation at Sheffield Park now for the engine to be made ready for its next return trip.
And then there was the 9F, the king of the British freight locomotives. In some ways, the 9F was an ugly engine. The 10 coupled wheels looked too small, the boiler looked too high, and you could see daylight in the middle. But railwaymen loved these giants with their little 5-feet wheels, especially when it slowly dawned on the railway world that they could run at 80 or even 90 miles an hour. The wildlife artist David Shepherd bought 2 standard engines from British Railways back in the 60s, and has kept one of them ever since.
To me, who owns this massive monster, Black Prince, the 50s were the most exciting time in steam locomotive development in this century, because that's when the standard locos came in, of which this is a 9F, 251 were built. They were the ultimate, and this one, my own Black Prince. I'm so bloody proud of it I can hardly speak.
David Shepherd's engine was just 8 years old when he bought her, the 17th to last engine ever built, and he's owned her now for 40 years. Most railwaymen agree with David Shepherd that the 9Fs were phenomenal machines.
I think they were. I mean, for a start off, you were driving something pretty impressive with 10 coupled wheels, the high running plate, the big boiler. People used to call them spaceships and all sorts of funny names. You really felt that you were in charge of some lump of machinery when you took one of them out. Now, a lump of machinery is no good without the steam, and once we'd found out how to make them steam, we began to enjoy them. We never had to run them at high speed, but I understand that they would run at very high speeds with great smoothness. Despite their great huge cylinders and massive balance weights and all the rest of it, they ran really, really smoothly. I think they were a marvellous engine.
As you can see, it's big, it's full of character. For its size, I think it's probably one of the easiest locomotives that we've got to drive and fire. It's very user-friendly. Bearing in mind, when it was designed in the late 50s, it was designed to burn rubbish coal that was available. It's designed for ease of maintenance. You can get to every part of it very easily. I think it's just wonderful. And then when you're doing 25 mile an hour up the line with a 6-coach train behind you, you get a talking coming up towards the tunnel. You'd like that.
The Great Western built the last one, Evening Star, and for a while it pulled a crack express called the Red Dragon. But then someone in authority reminded them that this was supposed to be a goods engine. When they first came out, there was much scratching of heads among BR firemen who were struggling to make them steam, and it wasn't immediately obvious what the problem was.
We were at a loss when we first got on them, to be quite honest. The first time I ran a train to Basingstoke, my fireman, a good fireman called Len Butler, was firing away in his normal manner with the fire the normal shape, and yet the engine wasn't steaming. And when we got to Woking, we realised that we were going to be in trouble. We left Woking, started climbing up the bank to milepost 31, and things got worse. And in the end, I realised that the lack of water in the boiler meant we'd have to stop while we were still pointing uphill with some depth of water at the back of the boiler. So we stopped. And we stood there in the dark, and Len said to me, "What's wrong with her, Clive? I can't make it steam." And I looked in the fire, and it looked like any other fire I'd ever seen in any Pacific. I said, "I'm bugged if I know, Len. What's wrong with it?" But we made the steam enough to carry on and got to Basingstoke. When he threw the fire out, he called me over and he said, "Clive, look at this." When he'd shoveled out the fire, there was none in there. The fire, which was up to almost the top of the door at times, was only a foot thick, because the depth at the back of a 9F firebox is no deeper than your palm to your fingertips. There's no depth there. So his problem had been that he didn't have enough coal in the back of the box, even though had he had the fire at that level on any of our Pacifics, it would have been 18 inches deep. And that was the trouble. And all you had to do was fire it ridiculously high so that you could barely get coal in between the top of the door. That was the only space you had, and it would steam. So the next night I said, "Fire it ridiculously high," and he did, and it went beautifully from then on. We never had any more trouble.
In a rare moment of egalitarianism, the Nationalised Railway Board had invited engine men to help design the standard footplate layout.
The ergonomics of a 9F was pretty perfect. A bit of a climb to pull sand up onto that running plate to fill the sandboxes. That was a bit of a hike for the firemen. But from the point of view of the cab, you were in great comfort. Well protected from the weather. Not too hot in the summer. A slight danger of burning your wrists when you fired the back corners of the firebox, because the firebox on a 9F slopes into the cab at an angle that means that when you fire into the back corners, you can easily touch your wrists on some extremely hot bits of metal that surround the fire door. So that was a bit of a problem. And some people wore gloves firing them, which was very unusual. to actually put gloves under fire. You could sit there with your feet up on the injectors and relax as a fireman once you got the fire right, and you felt yourself in some sort of a heaven for firemen, really.
On a day of sunshine and showers, Dave Gillam has been rostered to drive a 9F for the day, and that's heaven for any driver.
All right, let's wander into forward gear. Okay, we've got the road. Steam brake off, back brake off.
Dave's first stop is at the water column, where you need to come to a halt at just the right spot.
Try and stop it in the right place. There we go, steam brake on, back brake on. Turn the little jet off for the brakes. Wind it back to mid-gear so we don't go anywhere when we're filling up with water.
Handbrakes on.
Handbrakes on, cylinder cocks are open. And let's put some water in. Yeah, it's warming up now. Okay, it's a single line token, shock, stick in the holder. Okay, steam brake off, forward gear, back and brakes off. Bit of regulator. Still got the cylinder cocks open at the moment because it's cold and wet. Wind her back. Thanks a lot. Wind her back on the reverser, about 55%. Got the advance, which is the signal into the single line section. Clear of the station limits. A bit more on the regulator. Wind back the reverser. Just under 45%. Cocks are still open, just to make sure she's fully clear of all the condensation and the water.
Shut them up now.
For whatever reason, the noise levels and the general ambience of the 9F's footplate is noticeably better than on some other standard designs.
Coming along through Pokeswood now. On the level gradient. As we come round the corner here on the curve, we'll go on the Freshfield Bank, which is about 1 in 75.
Originally, the 9F was to have had 8 coupled wheels and 2 carrying wheels under the cab, but the designer argued that 10 coupled wheels was better for adhesion, and you can see how they just managed to shoehorn the bottom of the firebox in between the last 2 axles.
She's sounding sweet as ever. Bring her in a little bit. Okay, we've got a long climb, well, a reasonably long climb right up to the tunnel, 1 in 75. Just round this curve we've got a fire slip of 10 mile an hour slack, so just as we get going we have to slow up again, but that's life.
If the 9F was the most numerous standard type with 251 built, there was no doubting the smallest class of just one, the lone 3-cylinder locomotive Duke of Gloucester, Britain's last attempt to design a high-speed steam locomotive, and it was a fantastic piece of engineering. The Duke had a troubled career, but has now re-emerged better than ever, thanks to preservationists like Gary Shannon.
71,000 was designed in 1953 and outshopped in 1954. She was the last express passenger locomotive to be designed and built in the UK, and her existence comes about following tragic loss of another express steam locomotive in a rail accident, which provided really BR an excuse to have one last shot.
But BR got it wrong. The boiler wouldn't produce steam reliably. That's now been put right with a better type of double chimney and various other improvements to the engine's breathing.
It was always felt during BR service that the locomotive didn't get enough airflow to the ash pan. As a result of that, Jeff Sands, who was the shed master at Crewe North, where the loco was stabled in BR days, cut slots in the side of the ash pan, probably in a desperate attempt to try and improve the drafting. But this time around on the overhaul, we built a brand new ash pan, and we've increased the amount of draft in the ash pan by provision here of extra doors, extra draft damper doors at the back of the ash pan here, and we've also increased the size of the damper in the centre of the ash pan, which of course you can't see from here. The result of this is better airflow through the grate and better combustion of the fuel, more efficient combustion of the fuel, and improving the steam raising capability of the locomotive. So with this aspect we're very, very pleased with. And that, coupled together with the Carl-Chap blast pipe, is really giving us now very good steaming capability.
If Duke of Gloucester was originally bad at producing steam, it was always very good at using steam, thanks to its 3 sets of British Caprotti valve gear. That's the system turning cams like a car. Locked up in this chassis was the potential to outperform any other express steam locomotive, and now, at last, that potential is beginning to be unlocked.
The valves on this locomotive are the poppet type valves, like large car valves, and they're situated in the top of the steam chest of the cylinder, just in here. And those valves are held in a closed position by steam pressure and opened by cams located in a cam box. Each of the 3 cylinders has its own cam box. And all this equipment, by the way, we had to make new, the cylinders and the cam boxes. They'd been sectioned and put in the Science Museum. The cam box is driven by a series of drive shafts from the return crank on the centre driving wheel here. The locomotive has developed quite a formidable reputation now for being a strong engine, a reliable engine in mainline service, and it's been pulling some pretty heavy trains, 500, 550 tonnes, up banks such as Shap, and recently up Honiton, with some formidable horsepower performances, 2,500 plus horsepower. We have only had the opportunity really for testing this on relatively few runs so far, but things are looking very promising. So I think she's proved really now to be probably the most powerful steam locomotive design ever built in the UK, and now it's really realised the expectations, I would say, of its original designers.
The steam loco is a hopelessly inefficient machine, converting just 7% of the heat energy into useful work. But of them all, the Duke alone reached 86% of the theoretical maximum efficiency. So does its regular driver Tony, a former King's Cross man, rate this engine as the best of them all.
As far as I'm concerned, this is number 1. But the only other engine that could be anywhere near it is one I used to work on, and they were the Peppercorn Pacifics. And there's one goes out working on the main line, Blue Peter. Yeah, so it's a close thing between this and Blue Peter.
Before the start of a trip on the Mid-Hants, there's time for a quick look at the fire.
On Pacific locomotives, they've got a wide firebox. You fill your back corners way up here, because the box goes to about there, that way, and the same that side. So you fill these back corners right up so you can't get no more in, and then under the door. So the fire is sort of square so far, and then a gentle slope. If you keep feeding your coal in your back corners and under the door, it takes the fire down to the front.
Adrian, the fireman, has put about 200 shovelfuls of coal onto the fire. At high speed, Duke of Gloucester's 3 cylinders produce a noise like a diesel, and there's a hint of it as she gets into her stride. With its roller bearings and its echoing steel cab, 71,000 is not a quiet engine on the footplate.
I've actually built the back fire up. It's keeping a good back end in, and just casually feeding down the sides, across the middle and across the front. The main part of keeping the engine warm is keeping a good back end in on it, and you can just basically just feed it across the grate then. It makes life easier, rather than letting the back end get away from you, in which case you've got to, you know, it's a lot of hard work to put a back end in on this when you're actually pulling away. So it's the essence is all in the pre-work of building a back end up and then just maintaining a constant watch on the fire, really.
Of course, the great unanswered question is, what were we doing designing all these new engines in the 50s when diesel traction was just around the corner? Well, Britain is built on a bed of coal, and imported oil was a luxury post-war governments felt they couldn't afford. But then gradually it dawned on everyone that this machine and its sisters were just a herd of white elephants. And suddenly they were swept away by the rush of economic inevitability. Here, one man controlling 2 locomotives can deliver 2,000 tons all on his own. It's a winning formula in a world where cheap labour had gone forever. And comfort is very seductive, even for a hardened engineman.
Compared with some of the traction we've driven in the past, where you're sort of stretching and, you know, and reaching and that, and yes, it is. I mean, the cab layout is good.
Once upon a time there were 10,000 railwaymen working at Eastleigh, and now a rusting diesel shunter seems to have the place to itself. It was these little boxes on wheels that did most to sweep steam away. But in some ways the standard engines had the last laugh. After all, a locomotive like Camelot still carries the Kentish Bell headboard, even if it is just a nostalgic recreation of times gone by. They had years of life left in them when BR threw them away, and that has been good news for the preservation movement. It's like turning out shire horses into a field so they can end their days in peace.